I am as an individual, and then I'll go into
Wonderful. That
found.
sounds like a great place to start, Ibrahim. I am so excited to have you as our guest and expert who has contributed so much to the chapter of Office Shock, the spectrum of belonging. Welcome, everyone, to our sixth talk since the launch of Office Shock on January 17th. Yes, we've actually had the opportunity to have these conversations with others like Ibrahim who have contributed to the book. And today's focus is all about belonging. I'm really excited that Ibrahim is with us. He's going to help us all, as he has helped myself, Bob, and Chris, my co-authors, understand this topic of belonging. It has become a bit of a buzzword, so looking forward to Ibrahim unpacking that. I would love us to all start this conversation together by sharing your identity. If you could
Absolutely.
share how you identify yourself in the chat, we can begin thinking together about, I would say, this fundamental starting point for thinking and understanding belonging. And with that, Ibrahim, if I can put you on the spot to kick things off, how about share your identity with us?
Happy to. First, let me just say thank you, Joseph, for just setting this up and allowing us to amplify this messaging around building belonging organizations. So, how would I identify myself? Where do we begin? Let's see. I am American citizen. I am Black. I am able-bodied. I'm heterosexual. I'm neurotypical. I am English speaking, and I'm cisgender. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a son. I'm a business owner. I'm a CEO of Ubiquitous Preferred Services, Inc. So, as you can see, the way I identify comes with many layers.
And I would add, in my experience, working and learning from you, at the core of those layers is a real passion for bringing belonging and increasing belonging in all of the work that you do, both within your personal life and professional life. Is that fair to say?
That is more than fair to say. Hence why you see belonging catalysts here. We're all about helping organizations build a sense of belonging within their organization so that people are valued, heard, seen, and just collectively understanding this is the space in which I'm able to have great conversations as well as bring extreme value to their organizations.
So, in our chapter, The Spectrum of Belonging, we've set out two ends to this spectrum, one end familiar and the other end different. Would love to hear how your identity and all of those layers enable you to move within that spectrum between familiarity and different.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one thing I'll share with you, Joseph, just from a let me go into more storytelling mode than trying to give you some sort of prescriptive academic approach to this. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a primarily Black community. However, my mom, because of her value for education, shipped me and my brother back and forth to an area called Flushing, New York, which at the time was predominantly Korean. And so I didn't grow up in such a homogenous environment in terms of going to school, going back and forth to my communities. And anyone who knows Queens, New York is the most diverse environment in the world. One of the things that I'll also share, in addition to just race and ethnic diversity, you know this well, but maybe the audience doesn't. My brother, he was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 2, right? And because of his diagnosis, he was confined to a wheelchair up until age 24 when he passed away, right? And so I've been embracing the disability community ever since then. And so that we taking a look at that, taking a look at how I grew up in Queens around so many social identities and so many ethnic groups. I mean, it's just been easy for me to say I have a sense of belonging in so many communities and environments because I'm familiar with so many communities and environments. And then on the other side of it, it's about curiosity and being proactive in going out to see new things that are happening in communities and how they operate. So, that's how I ebb and flow between communities. Yes, I'm well accepted into the Black community. My friends will tell you, there may not be someone more Black than Ibrahim, right? When I go, but that's great, because me being who I am authentically and sharing agency in the different communities that I go into, there's a respect and an appreciation.
So it really is a wonderful story to see how you kind of grew up with difference.
Yes.
How important has that been for your understanding of belonging, the importance of belonging, and really understanding beyond the buzzword what it truly means to be a catalyst for belonging?
Yeah. Just the first part of the question was, how has it helped on this journey? Is that what I heard, Joseph? Yeah. So I'll tell you, I used to work for a very large cosmetics firm in New York City. And I'll say the best cosmetics firm in New York City. And I'll tell you, one of the proudest moments that I ever had was when we built the first employee resource group. I was a co-contributor to the development of that. And the name of the ERG, which still exists today, is called Noble, Network of Black Leaders and Executives. And as a part of that, it was a moment for me where I said, this is it. This is the space where it gives us an opportunity to push, put our hands back and raise and lift others up. And I really wanted to drive that sort of capability into organizations back then. And so when I began to transition and, had my side business, I said, okay, let's put a focus in on how do we build diversity? And you'll see things that are in the market. And Joseph, when you get me, it's unfiltered. So you signed up for this.
Absolutely.
There are a bunch of ambulance chasers, right? Given the events that took place in 2020, it was like social unrest. Hey, something to latch on to. So let's just throw out a whole bunch of stuff. And, companies made commitments, and then they started doing these spray and pray exercises. And now there's a retraction in, diversity, equity, and inclusion spend. And I said, I think what people are noticing is that, you're selling them a bill of goods. You have to say, look, how do we just help people become more culturally proficient? How do we help them to drive sustainable change so that cultures can commingle and get together with each other better? And how does what you do align to what happens in the organization? If you look at the statistics, the average tenure of a chief diversity officer is 2 years.
Wow.
It's 2 years, right? And there's studies. We'll get the statistics if somebody wants it. It's 2 years. And part of it is because it's like, okay, we've put this figurehead here, but they don't necessarily have their agenda aligned to the corporate strategy and how we actually drive value there. So for us, just given the experiences that we've had, the education that we had, and by all means, it's a team effort. It's a team sport. Winning and building belonging organizations requires everyone. It requires your internal stakeholders. It requires your external resources that have a myriad of experiences from working with different firms, as well as people who have social identities that don't look like yours, which also means that if someone doesn't look like me, I need Joseph on my team to help me with my blind spots.
Mm-hmm. I'm really appreciative of kind of blowing up the ambulance chasing, you said spray and pray.
Yeah, spray and pray. Here, let's try a little bit of this. Right? Dr. Morgan, she'll talk about the Oprah Winfrey effect, right? Hey, you get a diversity plate, you get a diversity card, and all these things, and try to do this sort of equality methodology, which is not working. That's just it. It's just not working, right? It's really going in and instituting equitable practices within an organization. So, yeah.
So I'll give you 2 sentences. How do you define belonging?
Yeah. So the way that, we actually have a framework that we publish to help I have a mentor. His name is Earl Newsom. He said, Ibrahim, any chance you get, don't overcomplicate the simple. Right. And so we built out a model that talks about diversity, inclusion, belonging, and IFTF have enhanced it to add equity on the end of it, which we believe weaves all through. Diversity are the people, right? And I think Verna says inclusion is being invited to a party. Belonging is not only being at the party, but someone asking you to dance, having some, a food that you like that you can consume, especially when we think about religion, as well as a genre of music that I enjoy, right? And that's a sense of belonging. And that can also help you understand maybe this is a space that I don't belong in, because not everyone belongs everywhere.
So that model that you're referring to, Ibrahim, is on page 114 of the book.
Yes.
And I just want to read back the 4 areas, and particularly the 3 that you brought initially to our collective writing of this chapter: the diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. Who the diversity, how inclusion, why belonging, and what equity. Could you give us an example of what that looks like in practice, either in organizations that you've been helping to cultivate belonging, or I'm really interested, you had mentioned when you had that interaction with the Black community, what that resonated with. Why did that give you that sense of belonging?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, one, foundationally, especially Black African Americans, Black Americans, we share in collective trauma, right? Now, we're not here to romanticize the problem. You know me, Joseph. I'm like, okay, we know what we know. Now, how do we go? Right? What I would say is this, in practice, when we're working with organizations, typically what happens, different people are at different ends of the spectrum. Some are early stage where they're just trying to get diversity right, let alone inclusion and belonging. And typically that's when we're working with individuals within companies where they're saying, how do we get diversity of social identity, cultural markers, and thought, right? Because if you have a collection of people who are, again, in a homogenous environment, you're going to continue to get the same thing. And you're really looking for some of that heterogeneous sort of activity where it's like, oh, you bring in a different perspective because, as mentioned in the books, you have a different set of roots, as well as you've taken different routes to get to where you are, right? So you'll bring in some creativity there. So we help with the diversity piece, which is really how do we get difference inside of our organization from a people? And then inclusivity, right? I say diversity are the people, inclusion are the communities, belonging is the culture. With inclusion, it's all about how do we get the right people in the right seats at the table within the organization to help drive better business outcomes, to help foster that sense of belonging so that we're not creating toxicity within an environment. And then when we talk about belonging, and I love a lot of the progressive firms that are at that stage of, we've got inclusion right. I'll tell you, as an example, I don't think they'll have an issue with this. Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Program, they are so intentional about inclusion. Like any group that you look at, you see just a diverse set of individuals, whether it's cultural markers, whether it's religion, accessibility, et cetera. They're doing a phenomenal job. When you start looking at belonging and the culture, it's really making sure everyone has a voice, everyone is being heard, everyone has an opportunity to contribute. And that doesn't mean, because the Black guy said it, let's just go with it. That's not what this is about, right? It's
like I said, we got to do it.
It could be, there's something interesting here, or there, what we don't want to do is suffer from psychological inertia, right? Where it's, but we tried that before. But if you tried it 20 years ago, I think a few things have changed. Right. And we also, I just got to add this other point here, Joseph, especially for those who are early in the journey with diversity. And to the point I just made, it's not about you saying, hey, I tried with the Black head of HR, so we won't do that again. They're not perfect. They're people. Right. And so we need to make sure we say, hey, look, maybe we give someone else a shot. I mean, it happens with other social identities. So,
yeah. And I think the evidence that you gave about the tenure of most DEI leaders is pretty indicative that just having that one marker, that one individual that can be BIPOC or any other social identity, is not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough. And what I wanted to share also, in our research on the chapter and all the conversations that we had, what I also learned, and again, Bob and Chris as well, was the importance of looking at the neuroscience as well.
Yes.
The question about identity, I thought you did a very good job of kind of exploding that with the social identity wheel from Sylvia Duckworth.
Yes.
That's something that we could also share with the audience. that was very powerful to look at the different frames of identity and really give some indication of, how unique we all are. If you recall the illustration from the chapter on belonging, we've got a wonderful illustration that is all about celebrating uniqueness.
Yes.
And I'm curious how does that message land, celebrating uniqueness in some of the more traditional organizations, which are more homogeneous than heterogeneous, more on the familiar end of the spectrum and not on the different end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I'll say there's been a pivotal moment in time in which even many of the conservative and may have been, to the terminology we're using, homogenous environments, that there's been a moment where people have recognized that diversity is great for business. I mean, it just is. They're seeing it like, wait a minute, we're missing out on an entire market. We're unable to, if we don't become a part of this, at least in the US, it's predicted that I believe by 2045, if you look at the Census Bureau, that the majority will no longer exist as the way it is today. I think it goes down to about 47% as the majority. What I'll say with the firms that we work with, primarily, when they hear about celebrating uniqueness, they've sort of come at it with open arms. Why? Because there's a sense of curiosity. But the thing is that, and I say this to all of my fellow colleagues who are in this space, who are working with companies, we have to create space for open and honest conversations with approachable people. Okay. Again, I quote him one more time, Earl Newsom. He said, Ibrahim, listen, sometimes you speak loudly. Don't speak so loudly that people can't hear you. Right. And so I think it's very important for us as practitioners in this space who are helping to move the needle within organizations, that we work with them and come from a place of grace, that we come from a place of compassion, and more important, that we have patience with each other.
So as a recovering management consultant, spent a lot of years trying to transition organizations to more sustainable practices. Yeah. How do you reconcile the objective of more diversity in having a space for those kinds of open conversations in a context which is very well structured, very driven on numbers and profit, very competitive, cutthroat in many situations because of the focus on quarterly targets, because of the career ladder going up the traditional org chart? Yeah. How do you go into organizations where you've got a lot of almost baggage, challenges in your face when you want to have, create that kind of inclusion?
Yeah, well, let me just share this. What's good is that I went to school to be an accountant. Somehow I landed in technology, which I'm more of an enthusiast now. And now we do all this belonging work. But in doing so, and this was in great dialogue with you, it's really the question I believe you're asking me is, how do we identify our return on belonging? Right? That's really what these, I'm maybe so, but let me go where I think you really want the answer. For us, we focus on building a belonging organization index with firms, right? Mm-hmm. And we like to go into understanding, get sentiment analysis of what's happening there. It's not the engagement scores and some of these other things that are out there, but it's more of understanding where you are as a baseline, for a baseline, and then beginning to identify, okay, what particular journeys can produce the best outcomes and results for you. And some of that may be financial. Some of that is attracting the best talent into your organization that you may not have thought of because you said, look, I'm only going to the top Ivy schools for this, this, and this. However, this person went to a community university, and the only reason they did it was because they had an ailing parent that they needed to care for. But they did have a full ride into Ivy fill in the blank, right? And so that for us, what we like to do is to make sure that we go into an organization that, to your point, they're saying, listen, let's make sure we're hitting our quarterly results, et cetera, and mapping out a plan just as you would in all seriousness, any product that's in your organization. How do we know if a new launch is going to be successful? How do we know if a new portfolio that, that our financial and wealth managers architect are going to produce the dividends and the returns that a stakeholder is looking for? We do the same thing pretty much in our practice.
So that journey that you're taking organizations on is a journey that is aiming for more belonging. And I'm just going to repeat just to make sure that I'm double checking I understand. So that vision, that future of an organization with more belonging, number one, has a diverse set of people.
Yes.
They have what you referred to as the markers of an inclusive environment.
Yes.
And that contributes to this culture where you're able to have open dialogue, where you're able to encourage going beyond some of the cognitive biases of familiarity and go towards interacting, learning, dialoguing, critiquing, and disagreeing. That is really inherent in engaging with people who are different. Is that?
Yeah. Yes. And let me just add, because I want to make sure we don't forget about equitable practices. It's also key that we incorporate equity there, right? So whether we're talking pay parity, growth opportunities, ensuring that we have the appropriate sponsorship. You've heard me talk with our clients about the 3 S's, what holds back diverse candidates. It's all about sponsorship. It's about stretch assignments, and it's about being on the succession plan, right? So we help in that space as well. But then just to get to something that's a bit more deep rooted, because we all know that it really takes the top to help things cascade down in a positive way. It's ensuring that we're creating these psychologically safe environments within an organization, so that when we talk about inclusivity, it's not just your physical presence in the room, but it's actually valuing your contributions in the room as well.
Right. So I heard 2 really important leverage points. The structure of the organization, particularly on the 3 S's that you mentioned. And it sounded like there may be room for a 4S salary. I think it's implied there because you talked about the importance of equity. So if the structure of the organization is aligned, then the culture, and what do we mean by culture? In our research and writing and learnings in our conversations, it's about communication. It's about stories. It's also about accepting or encouraging the celebrating uniqueness, that celebrating of one's own identity, and then not just the acceptance of other identities, but the active engagement of other identities. Is that a fair way to describe this future of an organization with more belonging?
It's definitely a fair summation of what the future belonging organization will look like. You're a great student, Joseph. You're a great student.
Thank you. Hey, you're an excellent teacher. So given all that, Ibrahim, I'm going to go back to my question, which maybe wasn't clear. What do you see as the primary inhibitors on the journey towards that ideal future with more belonging? What's holding us back? I mean, it makes all sense. But why aren't we doing more of this?
Yeah, again, it kind of, there's several. One, it goes back to the ambulance chaser model, where I think too many people are trying too many things in order to chase, the revenue that comes behind it, right? I think that's one. The other piece is that, listen, we have generations of just biases that we have. And I tell folks, when we go into an organization, and you can ask any of our clients, I share this story all the time. I say sometimes it's not even the person that you're working with that you're trying to change. I'm sorry, it is them, but it's not necessarily them who are just resisting it. For them, they're hearing, well, what you're saying is that my parents and my grandparents and all the things that they instilled in me is wrong, right? You're competing with that as well. You're competing with the conversations that are had around the kitchen table. And so I think some of the barriers that people run into is really, it's the mental model shift that has to happen, right? Where it says, hey, am I open to saying, no, wait a minute, I've changed because now I have new data points, right? I recognize that this particular social identity or this particular class of folks, they just want to live a quality life just like I do, right? So I think in order to drive some of that change, again, just being action oriented, is to make sure that again you're being culturally proficient. Make sure that you get people to bring outside in perspectives on what's happening, right? Both from the stories they share from their own personal experiences, as well as just again academics who have done a ton of research globally and what that looks like. Oh, and that's the other point, Joseph. I think we'll get to it, but diversity looks different in different areas, right? I'm speaking from a US centric perspective, but I know you're in Switzerland, so we could talk about EMEA as well.
Yeah, there's not much of that here, but that's for me. I wanted to emphasize one point. You mentioned the generational aspect, and when we spoke with Professor Lonnie Brooks for it was our third talk right after Aftershock book launch about the spectrum of purpose, he introduced such a powerful concept called ancestral intelligence.
Yes.
And I found that to be just so meaningful, particularly as a way for us to grapple with, you had mentioned, collective trauma at the beginning. So this generational, and there is more and more evidence from neuroscience that collective trauma is actually passed on. And some of the evidence actually comes from my tribe, Jewish collective trauma with what happened during World War II still influences behavior today. So I'm curious, particularly within your community, within the Black community, how much conversation is there about that collective trauma and how it might be inhibiting Black Americans, particularly in that context, to be able to engage in a society that is making very good progress, probably not fast enough for many of us, towards that difference, more celebrating unique as heterogeneous society.
Yeah, so let me share this. I'm not going to speak for every Black community that's out there because
No.
just like every other community, everyone has a different perspective. One thing I'll share, and we I know you and Bob quote this in the book when Martin Luther King talks about Black Americans are the only are the only set of people who have been enslaved in this country, right? So, there'll be a narrative from someone who talks about, oh, my father came here with nothing. Okay, yeah, but remember, when your father came, it was a decision, right? Or a parent did this and they grabbed themselves by their bootstraps, right? And then Dr. King will talk to, it's easy to tell someone to pull up their bootstraps, but if you don't have any boots, what do you do?
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, I think that's something that we have to also think about. The way 40, we can even just go down to 40 acres and a mule, right? So never happened in our community, right? And Amendment 13th and how that was all set up for slaves to be freed and then, imprisoned again for it. So, I mean, there's so much there. And just to go back to lineage and what you talked about, I think ancestral intelligence is important. I don't believe that, at least in the circles that I'm a part of, which again, a lot of us are very action oriented. Yes, we have to have the conversations about it because that's a bit of therapy. And at the same time, we look at how can we make progress, right? And what are we doing? And I mean, I can name several folks who are, really pushing the bar. Black wealth in general, I will say, Cedric Nash, he's pushing that. How do we make sure that equitable practices are happening inside of the Black community so that wealth is being generated? And I can go on and on, but I didn't come here to do a commercial for everyone, but you get it. I mean, I think it's important to share because you should know your history and your roots and have self-understanding. At the same time, you have to also take that information, process it, and determine what your path forward is going to be to make a better future.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons why the authors of Aftershock were also so inspired by the Afrofuturist movement. And Institute for the Future has done a number of segments, and I recommend for our audience to check those out on our YouTube channel and also on our website. But I'm curious, Ibrahim, in the interactions that we have had relating to Afrofuturism as a way to really flip the collective trauma into a more positive vision of what can be. not just for the Black community, but particularly within America. I think it's very, very interesting. Curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my take on it with Afrofuturism, absolutely, it's doing a positive. It's a positive. It's a way to take historical information, historical experiences, and make something positive out of it. But I think what we also have to keep in mind is that it's also a method for creating greater inclusivity, right? It's for creating greater inclusivity. It almost reminds me of like when I go in an organization and they're asking us to help to set up their ERG, right? And they're like, "Well, find all the Latinos." I'm like, I think most of the Latinos know what's going on in their community. We need a few people from outside of their community that could potentially, come together to help progress Latina women into executive roles, or Black leaders into their executive roles, et cetera. So I think it's what Afrofuturism is doing is it's actually helping us to say, what's a graceful and disarming way of encouraging everyone to be a part of this future that we're creating.
Right.
Specifically for Black people.
Yeah, the social movement is so much at the core of Afrofuturism. I think that's why we've all been really excited and inspired by it. Afrofuturism is also a good example of storytelling. And I know you mentioned briefly, and I know, with our work together, that you are using stories in, I think, a really unique way to help accelerate organizations along this journey towards more belonging. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so you're asking me to give away some of the secret sauce. So what I'll say is that, when we come into the organization to, and we work with several financial services, healthcare, life sciences, FMCG, to go in, get sentiment analysis of what's happening in the organization, and we allow people to share their stories, right? Which is from our perspective, is a better approach than crafting a survey with this Likert scale that says love or hate the experience that you had at work. Right. That's typically what you're running into, these NPSs. So that's as far as I'll take it, because my partners on our platform will say, "Ibrahim, what are you doing?"
Okay.
But yeah, we know stories are important, and you have to understand people's story, because the reality is, most of us in the workplace have a fraction of knowledge of what's happening with someone else's life or what their journey has been. So,
right.
The more that you give someone an anonymized way of sharing their stories, both good, bad, and different, I think, those insights help your organization.
Are you seeing collective stories emerging as a manifestation or a signal that they're on the journey towards more belonging?
Absolutely. So yeah, you talk about signals, and obviously our belonging organization, Radar, right? So yes, it's really interesting to see what happens with the social identities of women specifically. I will say that. And some of the marginalization that happens across specific diverse women. And McKinsey and Lean In just published a report about women in the workplace. And if you look, Black women are the most marginalized community in corporate America. I mean, hands down, if you look at the statistics. And so that's why if you know me, Joseph, I stay away from the people of color narrative, because I don't know really what that is. I know who people are and how they show up. And I think it's important that when we look at these signals in an organization, that we take them seriously, and then that we're responding to creating a better environment for those that could be marginalized, suffering from inequities or some sort of injustice.
Is there an example? Because I do think that's so important to be able to, again, help us begin to understand how might we all be catalysts for more belonging in our organizations.
Well, there are several ways. So to be action oriented, number one, I would say the first thing is to listen. I don't think we do enough of that. Right? Let's actively listen. Right? 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. The second piece is that we should be intentional about inclusivity. And honestly, it starts with the people leaders. You know, the cliche term of people don't leave companies, they leave their bosses. It's the leadership. And how are you going about creating and fostering, again, a welcoming environment where people can actually engage with each other? The other piece that I would say is that you should, and I mentioned this earlier, you bring people in that come in from the outside who can really speak to the topic, as well as give you a set of tools and actions to move forward with. You don't want to have individuals coming into your organization and just romanticizing a problem, because what happens is, yeah, you'll get a bunch of people galvanized and upset about what has taken place, but then they don't have anywhere to, you know, they don't have a way to say, okay, but this is how we remedy it. This is how we avoid it in the future, et cetera. The other thing is, I think it's important to run workshops with your folks. I'm so serious about that, because when you're behind closed doors and you can establish a social contract with a set of leaders who say, this is the moment where we can be vulnerable, and this is Vegas rules. If you're in the UK, it's Chatham House rules. You know, that's the way forward, so that everyone can say, okay, this is what I'm going through. Okay, this is my experience. You know, this is why I respond in this way. And most times what we discover is that people just fear the unknown. That's really what it is. And when they get to meet a person like me, they get to meet a person like Joseph that comes into the room that says, okay, you know, ask me what you want, share your thoughts. And then they get answers that they weren't expecting outside of what, you know, they see on the news, these 24-hour news channels. Then you find that they get to a better place.
And I can understand how important it is for you to have a very clear sense of your identity, to be able to then go into conversations, create that safe space in order to encourage others to articulate and get their own clarity about the multitude of identities that they have.
Absolutely. Let me share a story, and this one will be a bit provocative. I know we only have a little bit of time. You know, we were doing a delivery up in like northwestern Seattle, right? And of course, I shared with you the history about my brother, etc. And I want to tell my practitioners, you have to be careful when we say we're creating space for open and honest conversations. Ask what you want, say what you want. You know, my team prepped me. Hey, Ibrahim, what if they say this? I'm like, okay, I hear that in every rap song. Keep going, right? And so I'm facilitating a session, and a woman says to me, she's like, well, you know, all this language is changing. I don't know, like you talk about your brother. What do I say? Was he handicapped? Is he crippled? And my heart almost came through my chest, but I tried to keep I kept my composure and didn't speak. But what it was, and because of the way it came out so freely, I knew it came from a place of she really didn't know. Right. And for her, it was, I don't have the language, right? I don't know how to communicate on this topic, right? It's almost like when I speak to people and they'll say, well, you know, the color, I'm like, what year is this, right? So look, these things happen, but if you're not creating the space to have these conversations to educate and enlighten, right, so that people can actually make progress going forward, then you know, we're just going to remain status quo. And one thing, you talked about the generations in the workforce. I'll say this. Look, I come from, in the U.S., George Jefferson and what was his name? Now, All in the Family, right? No, I think that's what it was, right? Yeah. What was his name? Archie Bunker. Yeah, thank you. I couldn't get it. Archie Bunker, George Jefferson.
That show.
Yeah. Listen, you know, for us, and maybe we should have been offended back then with some of the things that were being said. So our skin is a bit thicker around that. I would just say, especially to you know, the generations that are behind us, that again, just have some patience and grace with us, because we're not going to get it all right. Some of the things that, you know, we endured and encountered that we now, you know, are sort of jaded by, it's going to take us time to get, you know, acclimated into sort of where the society is headed, which to me sounds like a much better place, right? We just have to be mindful of that. And again, just have some patience. Look, there are people who are, you know, several generations ahead of me where I'm like, look, they'll never change, right? And they're like, look, you know, I'm I got a little more sand left in my clock, so don't expect much from me. And I get it, you know, do what you have to do. It's just, you know, we don't want to necessarily change your beliefs at that stage. Maybe it's just changing your behaviors, right? How we show up around different people. Let's just engage. But I would say, look, you might be surprised that if you actually open your arms and your mind to new people,
Mm.
you might just gain a new friend too.
You might just gain a new friend.
You might just gain a new friend.
Just get a new friend. And you mentioned generations as well. And I think generations is so important. You know, that our kids are coming into this very complex environment on, you know, kind of jumping onto the escalator on this journey to more belonging, but they're certainly, you know, a couple of steps past us, and hopefully going to get there faster. There are two really interesting questions, and I'm going to start with the first one. You had mentioned the interaction that you had with that woman, to use the word color. You know, didn't know any better, a little bit Archie Bunker, you know, back in the 70s. And this question is really interesting because it's all about, you know, what is going to be the future of political parties to deal with diversity and inclusion. Now, particularly with the U.S., being an expat in Switzerland, I enjoy watching what's going on in the United States and the extreme polarity. Unfortunately, there's not much spectrum, you know, from the outside. How do you see, you know, the future of politics, and I would even say community decision makers, and what we talk about in the book, community policy makers? So maybe it's not even about politics, but it's more about policymakers. You know, how are they going to be able to incorporate more belonging in order to try to bring the community, the country, the society to a better place? Because we've got to be working together in order to address all of the shocks that we were putting under the umbrella of office shock.
Absolutely. So let me first qualify. I am not a political sciences, you know, authority in this space whatsoever. I can tell you just from what I see with the World Economic Forum and a lot of the great work that, you know, Robert Smith is trying to push down for equitable practices. I think globally we're going to begin to see a shift to just more equitable practices around the world. When we talk about specifically here in the United States, you know, I know our current president has he's instituted, you know, several pieces of legislation that have required specific things around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, you know, we are beginning to make progress there, as well as you watch immigration and things like that happening again all around the world. As you have these dense communities of people who are diverse, you have to begin to make shifts, because guess what? They're voters.
Mm-hmm.
They're voters, right? And so as you again galvanize communities to support an agenda, people are going to support agendas that are in alignment with their beliefs. So I think and again, I may not have answered the question to the person that asked it, but because I'm not a poli-sci specialist, but what I will tell you is that there are things that are happening in Washington, D.C. that seem to be on the positive front as around DE&I. And then as well as World Economic Forum is doing a lot of great work.
Right. And you mentioned the importance of equity. I'll do a quick pitch for our next Office Shock talk with the executive director of the IFTF, Marina Gorbis, who has been leading a very interesting, very important piece of work around equitable enterprises. That's actually our chapter before belonging on outcomes. So we're going to be talking more in depth about that. And Ibrahim, you've touched on one of the other spectrums that are so important to be able to move the needle in the spectrum of belonging. Any other spectrums that you think are critical to contribute to moving us closer to community and organizations?
Absolutely. I know we're short on time. I would say agility. So as you get into the book, read the chapter on agility and having that flexibility, as well as what is it? Fractional work. I think it is. It's called fractional work, or I guess whatever people are calling the old moonlighting, right? Being able to do different pieces of work in order to grab those experiences with different people.
Right. Being able to have that flexibility, and we can have a whole nother conversation. And actually, it's a good point. I'll raise it in next week's talk with Marina about the gig economy and how, in most cases, it's actually just become more exploitative than what it was promised to be. But that'll be for next week's conversation. Ibrahim, I want to thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And again, on behalf of my co-authors, Bob and Chris, and particularly for myself, it's been an amazing journey to be able to learn from you on this topic. It is evolving. I think you bring such insights, but also such a boost of positive energy to help us all accelerate to communities and organizations that have more belonging. I just noticed there was one question about collective trauma. Collective Trauma is a book from Thomas Hübl, Hübel. We'll put the link in there. And then there was a question about nepotism. We'll follow up separately on that. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Ibrahim, again, thank you so much.
As always, my friend, thank you.
Everyone, have a wonderful rest of the week.
And thank you, everyone who participated.
Indeed. And hope to see everyone again next week. Bye.